All right. So thank you so much. We've just had a word of prayer, and we are beginning our Bible study tonight, entitled, as you can see here on the screen, Rooted and Built Up. And it is from the book of Colossians. And in a lot of ways, we're going to be connecting it to the book of Acts. And I know that a number of you who are here now, and those who are going to be joining us over the next couple of minutes and over our hour, they are also familiar a little bit with the things that were going on in the book of Acts. And so this is not to make you feel bad if you don't know the answers. We're going to be doing a little bit of review from the things that we learned in the book of Acts, because there really is a connection. And I think you're going to learn that today as we kind of go back through and talk a little bit about Colossians and some of the things having to do with it. You'll see how it connects to the book of Acts. And so this is entitled Rooted and Built Up. And so I had to find a tree with amazing root system that was visible and all that stuff. This is one of my favorite kinds of images. So
Randy,
there you go.
Randy,
Yes.
are you sharing your screen?
I thought I was.
No, I don't see anything.
You know what? There you go, Nancy. How about that? Let's try that instead. How's that?
Oh, that's better.
That's much better. And there we go. Like I said just a minute ago before we got on this and started recording, you would think I'd know what I'm doing, but no, I just don't. So y'all pray for me. I don't know what my problem is. Yes, lesson number 1 is the intro, and it is also going to be covering chapter 4. And I know that's going to be really strange, because most of the time, whenever you begin in a book, you're going to say, well, of course, we're going to begin with chapter 1, verse 1, things like that. But you will see here in a few moments why we're going to begin in chapter 4, and then we'll connect it to its historical relevance and some of the things that you've studied. So jump in if you've got the answers. And as usual, we're going to be trying for each and every person that's a part of the call and part of this class to be throwing in some part, some question, some observation, some memory, or whatever it might be. And so if you have the answer, jump in, and then you'll handle your duty for the night. And we'll all be enjoying and learning from one another. So here we go, doing a little bit of throwback and a little bit of review and a little bit of connecting it to the book that we just finished. We learn a number of very important things about the letter of Colossians by reading chapter 4. That is why we are beginning there. In the ancient world, letters, epistles, and other types of writing were sometimes designed differently than they are in the modern world. Much of what we know and want to know is actually going to show up at the end of the letter rather than at the front of the letter. So, for example, in John 20, the passage of scripture that I read for Easter Sunday, at the very end of that chapter, and by the way, it is the chapter before the last chapter of the book, but you can see it's even labeled as the purpose of John's gospel. Jesus told him, he's talking to Thomas, he said, because you've seen me, you've believed. Blessed are those who have not yet seen and yet have believed. And then Jesus performed many other signs in presence of his disciples, which are not even recorded in this book, but these are written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name. In other words, just before the very last chapter, John tells you why he has been writing this entire book. And in Colossians, you're going to see a lot of the information that you want to know about the letter that he's written at the end of his letter. It's just the way that it was done in the ancient world many times, not every time, but a lot. And so as you see here in Colossians chapter 2, this is where we get the theme for our time together, rooted and built up in him. And in Colossians chapter 2, verse 6 through 7, Paul writes, so then, just as you have received Christ Jesus as Lord, continue to live your lives in him, rooted and built up and strengthened in the faith as you were taught, and overflowing with thankfulness. And so that is our theme for the book. Let's begin here. As we went through our study of the book of Acts, we went in depth on a number of Paul's missionary journeys. How many missionary journeys were there? You guys remember? I'll accept two different answers, as a matter of fact. So you've got a really good shot at getting this one right. How many missionary journeys did Paul go on?
Well, it's three of them, wasn't it? But it's also the fourth mission that they don't call them quite a mission, right?
That's right. That fourth missionary journey was not really called a missionary journey. It sometimes is the thing that people refer to his trip up to Rome to be there in the presence of the Caesars and give his account before the kings. And so there were three missionary journeys that are recognized. And then that fourth is maybe a little bit extra and a little bit different. But let me ask you a question. Can you remember some of the characteristics of those missionary journeys? Just give me what you remember. Tell me a little bit about what the missionary journeys are listed and how they are kind of characterized in that book of Acts that we went through. You guys, anyone? Anyone remember that the missionary journeys were they long? Were they short? How long did they stay? Was it one city? Was it two cities? Was it many cities? What was the kind of characteristics that you see there? Anyone?
About 18 months.
About 18 months was the longest that he ever stayed in any one spot. If you can remember about where that was. Does anybody remember that city by chance? It was the city of Ephesus. That's right. Very good. Yep. And let me ask you another question. What were the characteristics? Was it just one city, two cities, three cities? What was it? Anyone?
Several.
Several, for sure. And as a matter of fact, if you remember, he actually went, and he was not only on a single continent sometimes, he literally went from Asia into Europe and then back into Asia. Now, anybody want to just flex a little bit and tell me what was the name of the city that Paul used as his home base? It was the starting point. Every single time that he left, it was a city that started with an A. Does anybody remember what that was? Just to show off. Anyone?
Antioch.
Antioch, that's right. Aren't you guys glad that Kirthy's here to remember every single? I mean, I think we should just applaud Kirthy. Thank you, Kirthy. You remembered. If nobody else remembers, I can count on Kirthy. Yes, very good. And that is what's happening in all of these different missionary journeys. Nancy, good job. Thank you so much. Oh, Nancy's giving you the clap on there with the emoji. I like that. Very nice. Okay, so let's go into this thing. What city was Paul living in at the end of Acts, and what was unique about his situation? Do you remember? From Acts chapter 28, what was the city that Paul was living in? Not hard, not difficult. You may remember. No?
Lauren?
What? No, he wasn't living in Corinth. Did somebody say Rome? I may have misheard, but he was living in Rome. And what was unique about his situation? He was actually in prison. Yes, I did hear you guys say that. And yes, you are right. Give me 1 second here. Let me get an admit one more person here. And yes, now you may be thinking, Randy, why are you doing this to us? Why are you insisting on going through all of this stuff? I want to show you how it connects. So Paul was living in the city of Rome and all of these things. Let's see a little bit about what's going on in his life and how that connects. Let's begin here. So in Colossians chapter 4, verse 7 through 18, Paul says, I'm going to deliver the letter to the Colossians, and there's two men that are going to bring this letter to you. Now, let's remember, in the ancient world, you didn't have email. Yahoo and Gmail were not created at this point. And so if there was going to be a letter that got somewhere, it had to come to you literally, physically. And this is something that we often take for granted, that the truth is that in our modern world, back in the day, you had a really hard time getting one thing from one side of the state to the other side of the state, much less from one side of the country to the other side of the country. Well, in the ancient world, it was even more so, even more difficult. But Paul successfully got his letters out from where he was in an arrested situation in Rome, and he was writing letters to people all over the Roman world. But he never left Rome. How did he do it? He sent those letters, which later became the biblical books. The letter to the church at Ephesus later became the letter to the Ephesians. You guys see what I'm saying? The letter to the church in Philippi later became the book of Philippians. You see what's going on here? So this is really important. Literally at that time, there were people who were carrying scriptural books for the very first time, letters from Paul to the churches and to individuals in those churches. And so we need to make sure and remember there are a lot of really important people that were involved in getting this information out. So very quickly, even though Paul was in prison in Rome, the gospel was not imprisoned. Even though Paul was in chains, the gospel was not in chains. It was still making an advance, even though Paul was in a place, in a spot where it felt like he was in a holding pattern. This is really important and really significant. So very quickly, let's read some of Paul's final greetings from Colossians chapter 4, verses 7 through 18. We'll read parts of it. We'll respond to parts of it, take some lessons from part of it, and then we'll read it all, and then we'll apply it. So here you see, Tychicus will tell you all the news about me. He's a dear brother, a faithful minister, and a fellow servant in the Lord. I'm sending him to you for the express purpose that you may know all of the circumstances and that he may encourage your hearts. He's coming with Onesimus, our faithful and dear brother, who is one of you. In other words, he's from your city. You know him. They will tell you everything that is happening here. So the men that deliver the letter are named Tychicus and Onesimus right here. Tychicus and Onesimus, carrying the letter that would later become the book of Colossians. Very interesting information. Now, when Paul sent the man to deliver this letter, he was where again?
Rome.
Revisiting what we said, he's where?
Rome. In prison in Rome.
He's in Rome and he's in prison. Here in Colossians chapter 4, verse 17 through 18, again, a little further down, read this along with me. Y'all follow along. My fellow prisoner Aristarchus sends you his greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. You've received instructions about him. If he comes to you, welcome him. Jesus, who is called Justus, also sends greetings. These are the only Jews among my co-workers for the kingdom of God, and they've proved a comfort to me. Epaphras, who is one of you and a servant of Christ Jesus, sends greetings. In other words, a guy from where you're at, a guy from your home city, he's greeting you. He's always wrestling in prayer for you, that you may stand firm in all the will of God, mature and fully assured. I vouch for him that he's working hard for you, for those at Laodicea and Hierapolis. Our dear friend Luke, the doctor, and Demas send greeting. How many of you guys are recognizing some of these names? Let me see your hands real quick, right? You're recognizing some of these names. You see what I'm saying? How it connects back to the book of Acts, not only in where its setting is and where it's being written from, but some of the characters that are a part of the book of Acts. Somebody give me a name here. Who's part of this crew now in Colossians that was also a part of this crew in Acts? We see at least one or two names that are jumping right out, right? Anybody want to jump in and give me one name at least there? Luke. Absolutely. Luke, the writer of Luke / Acts, the one book that became two books, right? And so we see that Luke didn't abandon him at the end. He didn't get him to Rome and leave them. He stayed there. And even though he was in prison, Luke was not. He was not charged with anything. So he was able to be there and then go out from there to be a blessing. Do you guys understand what's going on here? You see what's happening? This is how the spread of the gospel was happening. It was literally going in the hands and in the backpacks and in the travel packs and in these scrolls that were going out from a handwritten man named Paul, sent with his followers and his friends and his fellow workers, going out to other churches to encourage them. It's really powerful. He says, give my greetings to the brothers and sisters at Laodicea, to Nympha and the church that meets in her household, it should say. Remember my chains, grace be with you. Now, very quickly, we know that he sent these letters so he would, deliver those letters. Most likely, Paul was in the midst of his Roman imprisonment that's referenced in Acts chapter 28. And that happened about 60 to 63 AD. Do any of you guys remember the time frame when Paul was martyred or was killed by Nero? Do you remember the time that I gave you?
80 AD.
It was roughly 65 AD. This book of Acts usually is kind of dated about 60 to 63 AD. And while he was in prison, that's when he is believed to have written those letters. Now, let's take a minute real quick and kind of fold it back. Do you guys remember we had this discussion in the book of Acts that we talked about last Bible study? We had this conversation and said, should Paul have kept going and gotten thrown in prison? Or should he have stayed and not gotten thrown in prison? Which was better and which was worse? We had this back and forth and talk about it. And we talked about the fact that no matter what, if Paul had made a mistake that he shouldn't have made or not, we don't know 1000% sure. But one thing we do know, that while Paul was in prison, there were things that were written that were foundational documents of the New Testament church. In other words, when he was writing in his time in prison to different churches, those letters became scriptural books. And so that time was never wasted. And that's so important. For 2 years, Paul stayed in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. And he proclaimed the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. And so this is really important and really powerful, that even though Paul is kind of kept under lock and key, people are coming and going, people are coming to hear from his teaching, and people are moving in and out, and the gospel is still unchained. Now, any questions, thoughts, or comments very quickly before we kind of backtrack and show you why we're talking about Colossians chapter 4 as an introduction? Anyone? Questions, thoughts, comments, observation? Anyone? This is always your sign. You've got time. Anytime I'm taking a drink, you've got time to jump in with a question or anything. Anyone? One more drink.
The book of Timothy, those letters are written first, or the book of Colossians was written first?
So most people believe that the book of Colossians was written first. Timothy, and then eventually 2 Timothy. Most people believe that 2 Timothy was the last book that Paul wrote just before he was martyred, before he was beheaded by Emperor Nero in Rome. Most people, what they believe is, most scholars would say that Paul was in prison for those 2 years and then was acquitted and had some time to move about in freedom, but then was rearrested, brought back to Rome, and Nero became very belligerent later on in his rule towards Christians. And eventually the burning of Rome, you remember Rome burned while Nero fiddled, right? You remember that whole thing. And actually, you can still see layers of ash where Rome was destroyed in 64 AD. If you go and visit Rome in the modern world, you can still see the layer of ash in some of the oldest buildings there. But that whole city almost burned to the ground. Nero blamed it on Christians and started beheading them and killing them and martyring them at an incredible rate. And most people believe that Paul died somewhere around 65 to 67 AD, if that makes sense. Maybe a lot more information than you're asking for. I don't know. Okay, very quickly, I want us to reread this. Let's go back to Colossians chapter 4, beginning in verse 10. My fellow prisoner Aristarchus. You see that? Did you guys catch that the first time? My fellow prisoner Aristarchus. Now we know that Onesimus and Tychicus were walking around and delivering the letter. That didn't mean that every single person in Paul's ministry team and party was free to do the same. It wasn't just Paul that was in prison. For some reason, Aristarchus was also in prison. And then you may or may not have caught this. At the end of this part, Paul writes, remember my chains. He's reminding them very clearly, I'm writing this to you from a prison cell. I can't get free even though I wanted to. And so it's important to note that this book of the Bible is written in this setting. It's in the prison setting, and it's something that we cannot forget that it's a part of it. Okay, very quickly, Paul was under house arrest. People came and see him. He preached to crowds that came to hear his teaching. He didn't just simply sit there and wait in prison. Instead, he made very good use, and these letters came to be known as the Prison Epistles. Epistle is another word for letter, personal, not alphabetical letter, but a personal letter in that time. So let's go ahead and check this out. Do anyone, you know what? It's hard. If you wanted to take a guess at any of these, you could. Anyone have a guess at what some of these prison epistles are? Anyone? There are 4 of them.
Go eat popcorn.
Go ahead. No, that's not right. That's not right. No. Colossians, Ephesians, Philippians, and then I should give him to you in order. Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, those 3 in order. And then a personal letter to Philemon, a man who, by the way, lived in the city of Colossae, an individual believer. Now, here's why it matters. Ephesians is a treatise of the faith. Paul in prison, writing down his beliefs, not sure what's going to happen to him. And what about Philippians? Does it matter? Does it make it more powerful that Paul writes a letter where the word joy or rejoice is written like 16 times in 4 chapters? When he uses the word joy or rejoice 16 different times, does it make it more powerful to know that he did that, not because he was sitting on a beautiful mountain resort, but because he was in prison and he still had joy? You see what I'm saying? When you see these things in their context, you start realizing that you can't divorce the setting of what something is being written in to the things that were being written about. And we see here in Colossians, Paul is saying, hey, if I never get a chance to write to you again, I want you to be rooted and built up so that when you face difficult times, when you face challenges to your faith, you're not going to be blown about. You're not going to be turned away. You're going to be rooted and built up, and you're going to be strong enough to hold even when the tough winds blow. Now, can I just get real personal and real pointed? I think in this situation with coronavirus that we've been going through, I think it's been something that reveals something to all of us. Now, I'm not here to judge you. You're not here to judge me. That's not what I'm trying to do here. But can I show you something? In the tough times, character is not, some people say that tough times build character. I think they reveal character more than anything else. Does that make sense? Yeah, you can be building of character, but I think more than anything, it reveals to me, Randy, this is working, but these 2 or 3 things are the deficiencies, right? I mean, Like there's no better time than a storm to figure out if your roof is holding correctly or whether or not you got to do some patching and repairing, right? You guys understand the concept here? And in the midst of what we are facing, I would say, above all things, we probably should be encouraged that our faith probably needs to go deeper than we realized. Some of the stuff that we've had to face, it's probably reminded us, you know what? Some of it's right there where it needs to be, but there's some things that need to get shored up. And so when Paul is talking about this from a prison cell, and he's saying, if you never hear from me again, I want you to be rooted and I want you to be built up. It's saying something powerful. You guys understand what I'm saying? All right. So questions, thoughts, or comments on that? Anyone? Anyone?
Good. Yeah, I think that pandemic, I don't know, should have caused us all to take a better look in the mirror. But, well, in the end, after it prolonged, it stayed longer, I think it was a lot of people were wondering, was this the end? I mean, where was their faith at, you know?
Yeah.
But I think believers were getting stronger and stronger.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, I think that's where it should be, you know, that's how it should be. I think that's something where when the hardest winds blow, that's when we're supposed to be like driven to our roots, and our faith is supposed to be the very root of who we are, the very core of who we are. And so because of that, I think that you're right. I sense a feeling among Christians that says we need to go deeper here. We need to go and make this more a part of our cornerstones. And I think that's good. Yeah. And it did reveal some things for sure to those outside the body of faith. All right. Anyone else? Any other comment or question? Somebody else jump in here because I'm thinking I'm getting maybe one other Zoom spot here. Anyone? Yes, I'm asking you guys to help me out here. Anyone? All right. Well, listen, hey, some of you guys, y'all got yourselves on mute. That still doesn't exempt you. You still got to jump in there and throw in at least one thing. All right. Otherwise, we're going to accuse you of being sleepers rather than participators. All right. So, all right. Anybody give me a thumbs up? Nobody's going to give me an emoji or anything. I see y'all. I see what's going on. All right. Here's what's going on here. We know some of the happenings of Paul's visit to the city of Ephesus. If you guys remember back, the city of Ephesus, he was taken to the civil theater to give an account against Demetrius, the silversmith. Paul and Silas were present at that riot in the city. Paul had stayed there for 18 months. He wanted to get up and he wanted to give a defense, and they pulled him back and they said, are you crazy? You can't go up there. If you do that, you're liable to get torn to pieces. You can't do that. And then he leaves that city. And so you see what's going on in that prison epistle when he writes, right? And so this is all things that are happening here. One more second. All right, very good. That was the spot that I needed you guys to help me out because we've got one more guest coming in. All right. So let me see very quickly. Here we know some of the happenings of Paul's visit to the city of Philippi. That was where he was thrown into jail for casting out the demon of the fortune-telling slave girl. Do you guys remember that story? And then Paul and Silas were at midnight singing in the jail, and the jailer comes to faith and to know him. That earthquake and that conversion, all that stuff, that all happens in these people who are receiving letters from Paul in prison. And so we know nothing at all about what happened in Paul's visit to the city of Colossae. So the question is why? Here's the deal. There's a good deal of evidence that suggests that while Paul was familiar with the church at Colossae, he himself never went to it. There are three separate categories of that evidence. First of all, the details in Acts' retelling of Paul's 3 missionary journeys. In other words, we got a ton of detail. Now, if you forgot, I want you to take a look. Do you guys remember these? This was Paul's first missionary journey. Started off in what city? Kirthi, do you remember what city? That's right. Antioch, that's right. And so they left here, went here to Salamis, across the island of Cyprus to Paphos, all these different cities, turned around, came back, and then made their way back to Antioch. That's the first missionary journey. And then do you remember it got even more complicated in the second missionary journey? Left from the city of Antioch, went around this way this time, went to Derbe, Lystra, all of these places. And then you start hearing they went through the area of Galatia, Galatians. They went to these areas like this city called Philippi, the Philippians. They went and visited Thessalonica, Thessalonians, went to Athens and then over to Corinth, Corinthians, went back over to Ephesus, Ephesians. You guys seeing all of these things? And so as they visited all of these different cities and went all these different places, this is all happening in the different category and part of their trip. And then the third missionary journey, he did the same thing again, went and circled back, went back through Ephesus and all of this stuff. Well, where is Colossae? It's over here in this area. And this is the truth. Colossae is not listed on those, but you can see right here. You guys remember we talked about Istanbul, the place where East meets West, how Asia meets Europe. It's right here in this spot. This is Istanbul right here. This is Europe. This is Asia. And there is Colossae, about 100 miles away from Ephesus over to Colossae. You guys with me? Now, 100 miles, actually, Paul would have just jumped in his Toyota. It only took him about, you see what I'm saying here? 100 miles to Paul, very different than 100 miles to us, right? A 100-mile journey is something very different to the folks in the ancient world. A lot more dangerous and a lot longer to get there. And so even though Paul was not that far, he had all of these other cities and he had so much so much fertile ground, untapped resources and stuff. He didn't go there. But let's just go back here. Anybody, just for extra credit and just for showing off, maybe somebody that's quiet in there, from blank chapters 2 and 3, the 7 churches of Asia Minor, church at Ephesus, church at Smyrna, church at Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. Does any of this ring a bell? What is the book for 3 extra bonus points? I see Roseanne's like chomping at the bit to tell me.
Revelation.
Yay, there you go. Eric jumped in and stole. You know what? Next time you see Eric, you can smack him upside his head because that was not right. That was not nice at all. He jumped in there and you were trying. I was even calling on you, Roseanne.
Oh, sorry, Roseanne.
He's not sorry. He's not sorry. Now you see why that video image of me slapping, that's why these things happened, right? If you guys have been coming to church, y'all know what I'm talking about. I'm teasing Eric. From Revelation chapter 2 and 3. And let's go back to that slide. Here is the church at Laodicea. Here's the church at Ephesus. Here's the church at Sardis. You see these? All these different ones that are part of Revelation. And so you can see it all kind of connects and it's all a part of it. Now we know nothing of that happening because we know a lot of details of Paul's missionary journeys, all 3 of them, and Colossae's never mentioned. So that's a big deal. We do also see some things that it says in Colossians. Here's what it says in Colossians. You've learned it from Epaphras, our dear fellow servant, who is a faithful minister of Christ on our behalf. In other words, we sent him on our behalf. Probably Epaphras was the one who came and started the church in Colossae, not Paul. Let's not get it twisted. It is not every single church that was ever started in the ancient world was not started by Paul. Every single church in the ancient world was not chronicled in the book of Acts. Are you guys with me? Y'all understand what I'm saying here? So don't get it twisted. Paul was the greatest missionary that the church has ever had or ever seen, but he was not the only missionary that the church ever had or ever had seen. And Paul literally wrote to the people at Colossae, I know about you because I know your pastor, your founding pastor, Epaphras, told me about you. And here's what I think. He told us of your love in the Spirit. In other words, I've heard secondhand. I haven't seen it firsthand. You guys with me? You guys understand? So when Paul wrote Colossians, he's writing to people that he'd never seen. Not only do we see in the book of Acts, he never visits that city according to that detail, but we also see here in Colossians chapter 1, 7 and 8, we just mentioned, and here in 2, 1, I want you to know how hard I'm contending for you and for those at Laodicea and for all who have not met me personally. You guys see? Paul's telling them, you've never met me personally. I know about you. And I want to share something that I feel like God has put on my heart to tell you. Now, stop for just a second. Everybody had heard of Paul. If you were in the church, you probably had heard of Paul. This letter made a difference in this city. I have no doubt. It wasn't just a great letter that eventually became scripture that was profitable later. I have no doubt this was something powerful for Epaphras and for all of the people in that city. They grasped, hey, the big guy cares about us enough to write a letter, and he knows some of our names, and he knows people from here. This was a big deal. And Paul was writing some of the things that Epaphras and some of these others had been teaching. This is a great reminder that we are all in kingdom work together. It's not us versus them. It's not them versus us. It's, hey, if we can help you, I'll give you what you can give, or I'll give what we can give, you give what you can give, and together we'll accomplish the kingdom work. This is important, that Paul was definitely a team player. He wasn't like, hey, I got more than my fair share. It's pretty important that we realize that. All right, questions, thoughts, or comments? Anyone? Okay, so let me show you something else. I hope these maps are as helpful to you as they are to me. Honestly, I'm a visual person, and so it helps me. We know that this is Ephesus right here. Do you guys see my cursor? You see Ephesus right here. We know that Paul spent at least 18 months to 2 years, to 2.5 years, I think, even in Ephesus, about 100 miles to the west of Colossae. But what we just read, he said, I'm contending on your behalf as well as the people at Laodicea and everyone I've never met face to face. He kind of lumped Colossae in with the Laodiceans, who he said he had never visited face to face. We're going to look and see later that he also kind of talks about the people at Hierapolis that same way. Colossae to Hierapolis, 13 miles. Colossae to Laodicea, 10 miles. Paul wrote them a letter, but if you were here at Laodicea or in this area with Hierapolis over here, 13 miles, 12 or 10 miles, you probably would have come to see the folks at Colossae. Do you guys understand what I'm saying? He never came this far. He never came this far. He probably never came this far. So we see what was not said, or what was said and what was not said in the missionary journeys as well. All right. And then we see what the scriptures don't say. Here in 1 Corinthians, Paul very clearly talks about how, hey, when I was with you, I preached nothing among you except for Jesus Christ. And then you go back and you look at the one in 1 Corinthians that we just read, or the one in 2 Corinthians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, Galatians, where we read here in Galatians, as you know, it was because of an illness that I first preached the gospel to you. He's like, remember when I came to you and I preached the gospel for the very first time? Do you remember the situation? He never says anything nearly that familiar with the people at Colossae. So we're almost positive he never met them face to face. You guys with me and understand? So this is really important as well. Everything that Paul writes is not to address a certain and specific thing in that church, but something that applies to all of the churches all the time. You guys follow? In Corinthians, if you've gone through Corinthians with us, you know that there's some very specific things. He said, hey, one of you is sleeping with your stepmom. That's not going to fly. You got to get that guy out of the church, and he's got to stop that stuff that he's doing. That's not okay. That's the New Texas version, and also the Jerry Springer version of what was going on in Corinthians. Okay. But you can go back and look in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 or 6, I believe. He's literally addressing a very, very specific problem. That's one way to make sure none of y'all are falling asleep, I suppose, right? So there you go, a very specific problem. In Colossians, it's very broad, but it applies in every single way to every single church all throughout history. So as we see it, we grasp that and understand that. All right, questions, comments, thoughts, anyone? Okay, so let's talk about this very quickly here. Tychicus will tell you all the news about me. This is some rereading, and you will see it. And I want to ask you guys know my normal question. What is it that's jumping out at you? So you guys get prepared. I'm going to be asking that question, and then we'll talk a little deeper, okay? Tychicus will tell you all the news about me. He's a dear brother, a faithful minister, and a fellow servant in the Lord. I'm sending him to you for the express purpose that you may know about our circumstances and that he may encourage your hearts. He's coming with Onesimus, our faithful and dear brother, who is one of you. They'll tell you everything that's happening here. And then he says, let's see here. My fellow prisoner Aristarchus sends you his greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. You've received instructions about him. If he comes to you, welcome him. Jesus, who is called Justice, also sends greetings. These are the only Jews among my co-workers for the kingdom of God, and they've proved a comfort to me. All right, so what jumps out to you in these 4 to 6 verses that we just read? Anybody have anything that jumps out to them? Anyone? There's something there, y'all. I'm telling you, there's something there. I think some of y'all know when you're waiting for someone else. Please don't. Go ahead, jump in.
I have a question. Why are those parentheses in the verses there?
This right there, that's just what the translators have seen. They speak about, they're speaking in the terms that Paul was probably writing in. You know how he says, you have received instructions about John Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. That's what it is. It's basically just a rough translation. Does that answer your question? Is that the one that you're asking about? I should clarify that first. It is. Okay, very good. All right. Does somebody see something here? Nancy's right there close to something that I think should be pretty clear. Anyone?
Kendall is saying that it's interesting. These people are all sending their love from prison. They're all in prison together. You know, a place where you're not likely to be happy and lovey, you know?
Yeah. That's a great comment, Kendall. And your voice has changed, but I still love the comment. It's very good. Kendall, I'm just teasing. I know you're not the only lurker. I just want you to know that, right, Leroy? Not the only lurker in this house. But yes, writing from prison, and see why it matters to know the context, see why this is not, hey, this is not love because I'm in a happy mood. This is love that is a choice and a decision. It's great. Good observation. Anyone else have something that jumps out to them? Anyone?
There are a few Jewish brothers also who were helping Paul in that situation, who proved to be his comfort. I mean, Jewish brothers being there.
Absolutely. Jewish brothers who had accepted Christ. Jewish people who had said, this is our Messiah. The rest of my nation may not see it, but I see it. I'll leave my family, leave my friends, and I will follow my Lord. Powerful stuff. Very good observation. Anyone else? I've got time for one more observation, something jumping out. Anyone? Okay, so I won't belabor, I don't want to ever make it awkward, but did you guys see John Mark, the cousin of Barnabas? Do you guys remember what happened between John Mark and Paul?
I'll send him home.
Paul sent him home. Why did he send him home? You guys remember that story?
Yeah.
Paul thought he left Barnabas and Paul during the missionary journey.
He left him high and dry. He was like, no, I'm not taking him on the second missionary journey. And you guys may have noticed back here, and I even pointed it out, you may have noticed this little arrow right here where there's a second dotted line. It's because when they were starting to set out, Paul and Barnabas and John Mark were on the first missionary journey. Second time, Barnabas was like, cool, we're going to take my cousin Mark. And Paul was like, we ain't taking him. We ain't taking him. He left me high and dry when I needed him most. No, I'll bring someone else, but it's not going to be him. And so the disagreement was so sharp, the Bible says, that they split ways. This is Barnabas, the man who vouched for Paul when nobody wanted to be around him because they thought he was a fake. They thought it was a way of him getting into the church and infiltrating the church and then making all of them recant or die. You guys remember? And Barnabas was the guy who went to him and pulled him in. He's also got a cousin named John Mark, who later on wrote a pretty important book himself called The Gospel of Mark. You see where I'm going here? So in the midst of all this craziness that's going on, Paul says, you've heard about John Mark. When he comes to you, welcome him. So in Acts 15, there's a big problem between John Mark, Barnabas, and Paul. So Paul takes Silas, they go. John Mark and Barnabas, they go. And they got two missionary teams and a big problem between the two. You guys follow what I'm saying? Ain't it good to know that it's not just modern day churches that had church squabbles, right? I mean, right? I mean, people are people. It's not good that there was ever infighting, but isn't it good to know that when there was infighting, the Bible didn't pretend it didn't exist? Isn't it good that God's pretty clear that humans are humans and they screw up and they mess up and they need to be extended grace from God, but they also need to extend grace from one to another, even when you're a super saint like Paul? Pretty interesting stuff. That may be a big takeaway. Spoiler alert, it's coming. All right, here we go. Let's go on a little further. Epaphras, who is one of you and a servant of Christ Jesus, he sends you greeting. He's always wrestling in prayer for you that you may stand firm in all the will of God, mature and fully assured. Another way of saying rooted and built up. This is a constant theme in Colossians. Becoming mature in your faith, stopping that weakness of your spiritual life and getting rooted in Christ so you know him so well that he's like a friend. He's like that anchor that you need. I vouch for you, or vouch for him that he is working hard for you and for those at Laodicea and Hierapolis. You guys recognize those cities? Our dear friend Luke, the doctor, and Demas, they send their greetings. Luke's a pretty important guy, having written the book of Acts, been the chronicler of all that was going on for Paul. Give greetings to the brothers and sisters at Laodicea, to Nympha and the church at her house. No, she's not the girl who makes the tortillas here in Houston at Nympha's. It's a different Nympha, that she was hosting a house church. And there's no such thing as a good house church in Houston, Texas without tortillas. Amen. All right. So after this letter has been read to you, I'm the only one who am enjoying my jokes tonight. That's okay. I'm still enjoying them. After this letter has been read to you, see that it is also read in the church of the Laodiceans, and that you in turn read the letter from Laodicea. Tell Archippus, see to it that you will complete the ministry that you've received in the Lord. And I, Paul, write this greeting in my own hand. Remember my chains. grace be with you. Is there something that jumps out in these verses of scripture? Anyone here? Anyone ever heard of the letter to the Laodiceans? It's kind of been lost to history, hasn't it? You're like, hey, hold on. Paul wrote a letter that we didn't know about. I want to talk to you about this for just a second. The letter from Laodicea. What do we know about this letter? Is there a missing biblical book that should have been called Laodiceans, or something like Philippians, Ephesians, and Laodiceans? No. There was a letter, but it was never a part of the scriptures. And I want you to know something. The only letters that we have of Paul that exist are not the only letters of Paul that we know about. Look at this. In Colossians chapter 4, verse 16, just that thing that we just read, there's a letter that I wrote to Laodicea. You read their letter, and after they've read their letter, send it back to you, and you read theirs, they'll read yours. Think about it. When it took forever to get a letter halfway across the world, if it was written and it was powerful and it was encouraging and it was uplifting and it was insightful, you read theirs and they read yours, and you both learned from it. You guys see what's going on here? And so Paul is writing to more than just one church and more than just one thing. Now we know that he also in 1 Corinthians 5:9 said, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. Well, we don't know anything about that letter that he said he wrote. And then in 2 Corinthians 7, he said, even if I caused you sorrow by my letter, I don't regret it. Although I did regret it, I see now that my letter hurt you, but it only hurt you for a little while. And he goes on and he says, and it hurt you to the point of where you repented and walked away from the sin that was a part of your life. So I regretted it, but then later thought, hey, if it brought about repentance, it was worth it. So we see that Paul wrote at least 3 different letters that we have no idea where they are, and they did not survive. Now, I don't want this to bother you. I want this to encourage you. And I will tell you why. To me personally, this tells me that we have what God wanted to survive, first of all. That not everything that Paul wrote was just automatically going to be considered touched by God. You guys understand what I'm saying? I mean, sometimes there's something that is just different. There's a different sense of God on that letter that he wrote. It's scripture, and you just know it. And then there's others that just weren't. And so it doesn't make Paul a bad person or anything like that. It just recognizes that God wasn't saying everything Paul writes, it's scripture. No, not at all. Just the things that God wrote with Paul inspired him. The Bible says that there are things that are God breathed into his fingers to write them in a very specific, very honest way, very powerful way, very Holy Spirit guided way. And some just didn't make the cut. Do you guys understand what I'm saying? If y'all understand what I'm saying, let me know. So this to me is encouraging because it helps me to understand that I have God's word. I may not have every letter of Paul, but I have God's word to me. And it included some from Paul, and some that Paul wrote, I didn't need them for my spiritual insight, depth. They'd have been interesting, but they weren't scripture. And that's a powerful distinction to draw. You guys understand? Any questions, thoughts, or comments, anyone? Anyone? I'm moving quickly to a close here. So let's keep moving. The homework assignment in preparation for week number 2. Yes, you can read chapter 1 and be good. Or you can read the whole book. I mean, it won't take you that long. Over the next week, if you want to read chapters 1 through 4, we're going to tackle chapter 1 in lesson 2. I know that's weird. Some of y'all logged on a little late. It's because a lot of the background, the setting, and the important pieces that we grasp to kind of get the full sense of the letter were happening in chapter 4. And so we want to also end on that high note that we're going to have in chapters 3 and the very, very first part of 4 as we conclude. But for next week, read chapter 1 or read the entire book and come with an insight, something that jumps out to you from that part of the passage from chapter 1. And I'll encourage you, you're not going to get demerits, you're not going to get your hand slapped if you don't read, but if you would like to go a little deeper and learn a little and even practice the idea of saying, okay, Randy, what jumps out to you? And then making notes of it, you'll be amazed at how God can speak to you through his word and not through his preacher or whoever else it might be. God's word will speak to you if you will let it. Here's 2 big takeaways from lesson number 1. Paul is the apostle that was never a one-man show. He partnered with many other people to be the great missionary that he was. These are just the people listed in chapter 4. A man named Tychicus, Onesimus, those 2 carried the letter to the Colossians. Aristarchus, John Mark, Jesus called Justus, Epaphras, Luke, Demas, all of these people, there's 8 of them that he calls out by name, that he says, they're interested in you, or they're coming to you, or they told me about you. He is not one man at the center of this universe. There are tons of people who have given their lives to the advancement of the gospel, and they're working as a ministry team. And then he gave greetings to 2 other people, Nympha, who is hosting a church in her home, female, her home. And this was not uncommon. Lydia did the same in the church at Philippi. And then Archippus, who was one more believer that he wanted to shout out and give a greeting to that was living there in Colossae. Paul was never a one-man show. Can I just say something? This is a takeaway. You need to do your part. If you're a part of God's family, you have a part, and you need to do your part. The best churches, the most edifying churches, the most edified believers have found their place, rolled up their sleeves, and gotten involved. Not found reasons to not be involved. Not said, oh, this is Paul's job. No, they've gotten their spot and they've rolled up their sleeves and they've gotten involved. And so I just encourage all of us, let's find our spot and let's fill our spot. Like, let's do those things, because Paul, who advanced the gospel more than anyone else, never did it alone. And if Paul can't do it alone, I promise none of us can. Right? Amen. All right. Here we see I'm sending Tychicus for this express purpose, going on and on. And then there's John Mark, that cousin of Barnabas that we mentioned. And then we see here, we go back to Acts 15, where the sharp dispute. Unless you're circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. This brought Paul and Barnabas into what? Sharp dispute and debate with them. Paul and Barnabas would have died before they gave up that truth of faith alone is what saves you. But they used the exact same word, that sharp debate and that sharp dispute, to describe what was going on between Barnabas, Mark, and Paul. The disagreement had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. I don't know about you, but here's what I say. In Acts 15, they were bitter enemies, about ready to go to blows. As we used to say in Oklahoma, they were fixing to go to blows, right? They were that mad. They were fighting mad. And then in Acts 28, at the end of that time, they were in the same place, and John Mark was a credentialed member of Paul's ministry team again. So what does that tell you? This is the second big takeaway. They parted ways in real anger. No doubt Paul wasn't easy to work with. His pace, his practices. Paul had a weird way of getting stoned not the good way, but the bad way whenever he was in cities, right? I mean, I'm not good. You guys follow me along here. Y'all understand what I'm saying? He was literally this close to death a number of different times because they picked up stones to stone him, right? And I'm sure John Mark was scared to death, and he ran and he deserted and he left. And Paul eventually realized, you know what? He can be forgiven and he can be brought back and he can be given a second chance. So as we look at this, both Paul and John Mark are undoing the sharp disagreement that they had that also affected Barnabas and Silas, and all four men and the kingdom work were all better because they grew up a little bit, and that they humbled themselves a little bit, and they rolled up their sleeves and got back to work for the most important part, and that was the kingdom work. And that's something that we take away and we go, wow, he knew what he was doing. Paul, he knew he was doing something that was way beyond just his petty little squabbles with whoever he was angry at that time. It was too important to not work together. So, all right, questions, thoughts, or comments as we bring it to a close. Anyone? Let me get at least one comment before we call it a night. Somebody jump in here and give me some kind of comment. Anyone? I thought I heard somebody jump in there. Okay. All right. Well, are you trying to say something there, Frank? I thought I saw you saying something. Give me a second here.
There. No.
There we go. Frank, I thought I saw you try to say something. Can you unmute yourself one more time, Frank?
Did you do it?
Right there.
Okay. I said, you said we can't do, Paul couldn't do it alone. And I said, that's why Jesus Christ came to be, he had people to be fishers of men to spread the word,
Yeah.
just like Paul was doing.
Just like Paul, just like Luke, Demas, Aristarchus, all of these men, all of these women, all bounding together out there to do those things. Very good. Very good. Anyone else before we end? All right. Well, thank you guys so much for your time and for your attention. We're all finished for the evening. I appreciate you being here, and may God bless you. We have only 3 get-togethers left, but I hope that you will make all 3 as we finish Colossians next week, chapter 1, the next chapter 2, and then the final chapter 3 and the first few verses of chapter 4. May God bless you guys. Y'all have a good rest of the week, and let's all remember to be rooted and built up in the Lord. Thanks, guys. Y'all have a good one. Good night.
Thanks, Randy.
Thanks.